To start.
Yes.
Yes, lovely. So I will just introduce today's topic. So we're talking about the Edinburgh history of the Transnational British Press in non-Anglophone countries, 1800 to 1914, which is the first comprehensive study that explores the 19th century transnational British press published in non-Anglophone countries across Europe, the Levant, the Mediterranean, Asia, and Latin America during a key period of press development and of British expansionism. We will first be hearing from the editors, Diana Cooper-Richet, who is senior researcher at the Centre d'Histoire Culturelle des Sociétés Contemporaines at the University of Versailles, Quentin en Yvelin, and the founder of the Transfopress network, and Isabelle Richet, who is Professor Emerita at the Université Paris-Cité, where she taught in the English Studies department. And I will put the list of speakers and their topics into the chat box if anyone is interested in specific speakers or topics, so we have access to it throughout and we can save a bit of time in today's session. So, Diana and Isabel, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. Yeah. The 19th century English language press, published in non-Anglophone countries, which is the subject of our collective book, is part of a much wider phenomenon, the foreign language press. The foreign language press concerns newspapers and periodicals which are written in a language which is not the or one of the official languages of the country where they are published. Until very recently, this press had almost totally been neglected by specialists of the media. Little was known concerning the more or less 270 titles in English that had been published in France, 70 in Italy, 50 in different German states, 20 in Belgium, 10 in Switzerland, dozens in Latin America, and others in Asia and the Levant between 1800 and 1914. In the 1880s, press directories such as Willing's Press Guide started taking an interest in these papers with sections devoted to, for instance, descriptive list of papers in English printed on the continent. In the 1890s, The Newsman, an American professional monthly, had a section called the Americo-British Continental Printed Press, and considered that some 250 English language newspapers were published on the continent, and that English speakers could find papers conceived for them in their language, be they in Bergen, Norway, Berlin, Brussels, Constantinople, Moscow, Paris, or Vienna. A few of these papers, such as the North China Herald, published in Shanghai, the Levant Herald, published in Constantinople, and Galignani's Messenger, published in Paris, were quoted in the British press, but most of the titles in English published abroad totally escaped the attention of the British press. They seemed to belong nowhere, neither to the history of the country where they were published and read, nor to the history of the country where their readers came from. No doubt that is one of the reasons why, till recently, they have been almost totally absent from academic research. In 2012, at the University of Versailles, Transfopress, a transnational research network for the study of the foreign language press, was initiated. Over the last 10 years, numerous colleagues from different countries and fields of research have joined the network. Transfopress conferences have been held in different universities around the world. There are active Transfopress research groups in countries such as Brazil and Mexico. Over the years, books and special issues of reviews have been published on different aspects of the foreign language press. The general outlines of this press, its initiators, the conditions in which these papers were published, how they circulated, where and how they were distributed, are now better known. One of the difficulties all of us encountered was how to locate copies of this press. Nevertheless, our volume goes to show that it has been possible to uncover an almost totally forgotten body of documents which were published in English all over the world during the 19th century. These papers and periodicals were published for British settlers and travelers who had been getting more and more used to a rapid flow of information and expected to be able to access it wherever they were. Thank you.
Well, so I will pick from here to say what we've tried to do in this volume is to offer the first comprehensive survey so far. We will probably discover other titles, but we have in our network, and we have contacted outside of our network specialists who've been working on this press for quite a while. So first, what we think this volume really brings is a new understanding or a broadening of our understanding of what the British press was in the 19th century. We cannot be limited to the British Isles. And what I want to do also, I think it obliges us to sort of decentering our study of the English press, to incorporate this very broad corpus. Remember that some of the contributors will mention it. I mean, some titles lasted for decades. There were daily papers who lasted for decades, so they are important. But you also have small papers that were sort of ephemera, but had some importance when they were published. So what I want to do, since Diana was shorter than anticipated, I will, in the few minutes that I have, I'd like to mention a few of the themes that run through our volume. The first one, which was quite obvious, is the transfer and adaptation of editorial models. We know that Britain saw the first press revolution, and most of the titles, you can see it on the cover photo, and most of these titles borrow their format, even the lettering and Great Britain, but most of them also gradually adapted to the local media environment. Also, what we discovered, and I think it's mostly on the chapters on France and Italy, there was a sort of new media category that was created in English outside of Great Britain, the so-called resort papers that were created on the Riviera, the French and Italian Riviera, in the Spa Germany, that were really a new kind of newspaper that both addressed the needs of the local British expatriate communities and also promoted various resorts. And this type of newspaper would develop much more in the 20th century. Another theme that runs through our volume is the circularity, can I say that in English? Yes, of the flow of information enabled by these newspapers. It's clear that they brought news from Great Britain to all those countries where they were published, but they brought news from these countries to Great Britain as they were widely quoted. We had a look for the Levant Herald, but that Burhan knows, it was quoted tens of thousands of hits we have when you look, in the British archive, the British press archives, etc. They were widely quoted in the British press at the time when there were not many foreign correspondents. And some English titles published in Latin America, in Japan, also in China, if I'm not mistaken, were published in English to be distributed in Great Britain. So there was the circularity is very clear in some of the contributions. Also, in most chapters, we can see how these newspapers functioned as cultural contact zones. between expatriate communities and their host countries. By addressing the needs of the expatriates and explaining the local tradition and the customs and traditions of the local culture, or by disseminating British culture, literature in particular, to the local readers, or by introducing the English readers to the cultural productions of the country where they live. This is clearly the case in Italy. I work in Italy, so where we have so many cultural magazines and cultural reviews dedicated to analyzing, promoting, and explaining the cultural creation. At a time, just to give an example, in Italy in the 1890s, there were 4 English language periodicals dedicated to the excavations of antique Rome. 4 of them, a weekly, a fortnightly, and 2 monthly at the same time. So there was a large public for that.
Sorry, Isabel, I think we need to wrap up soon.
Yeah, I just conclude. Yeah. So what these case studies teach us about the people behind this press, and I use people and not journalists because most of the people behind the press were not professionals, apart from some war correspondents like Whitaker in the Ottoman Empire. So to draw a portrait of these aspiring journalists and editors, we have tried to follow their transnational trajectories, their intercultural competencies, and to identify the many networks, local or international or transnational, to which they belong, as probably some of the contributions will show later. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think next we have Burhan.
Hello,
Hi.
can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much for this lovely organization, and thank you for having me in this meeting today. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In my chapter, I focus on the Levant Herald, an English language newspaper published in 19th century Constantinople. And I use it to ask a broader but very concrete question like, what did it mean to produce imperial news in English from inside the Ottoman Empire itself? Rather than approaching this newspaper simply as a foreign or a colonial outlet, I treat it as a part of a wider imperial information system that connected local realities with global audiences, especially in Britain and Europe. The Levant Herald was founded shortly after the Crimean War by James McCoan, a British war correspondent who had reported from Ottoman territories during the conflict. During the war, European readers developed a strong interest in the Ottoman world, and newspapers in London increasingly relied on correspondents who could report directly from the region. After the war, McCoan settled in Constantinople and imagined a newspaper that would permanently channel news from the Ottoman Empire to the wider world. From the beginning, then, the Levant Herald was designed to speak beyond the imperial capital. I mean, it aimed to circulate political, commercial, and social information from the Ottoman world to readers both inside the empire and abroad, and of course positioning Constantinople not as a peripheral space but as a central site of global news production. This ambition became even clearer after 1872 when the newspaper was taken by Edgar Whitaker. Whitaker's background is crucial here for understanding the paper's later development, because he was not only a journalist, but also a former consul who moved easily within diplomatic, commercial, and Levantine social circles. Under his editorship, the Levant Herald became far more than a reporting platform. It developed into a space where journalism, diplomacy, and imperial interest continuously overlap, often in unstable and contested ways. Whitaker built an extensive and flexible news network inside the Constantinople. For example, he gathered information from embassies and officials, and also from people working around the Ottoman palace or within the city's administrative structures. This method, of course, allowed the newspaper to publish news that was often unavailable elsewhere. At the same time, however, the political environment was changing. The censorship became more systematic, more restrictive, especially in the later decades of the century. Many reports that were gathered locally could no longer be printed in the Ottoman capital. Instead of abandoning these stories, though, Whitaker redirected them. For example, sensitive information was sent by telegram to London newspapers, most notably The Times, where it could circulate freely to global readership and re-enter the Ottoman world indirectly through the European press. This practice placed the Levant Herald in a constant state of tension with the Ottoman authorities. The paper was fined, suspended, and repeatedly shut down. Yet it continued to reappear, sometimes under different titles, such as the Constantinople Messenger or the Eastern Express, and these interruptions didn't weaken its influence. On the contrary, they revealed how central the newspaper had become within Ottoman and European information networks, and how closely it was monitored by the state as a potential political actor rather than a simple news outlet. What this case ultimately shows is that I would say English language newspaper in Ottoman world were not just the natural observers standing at a distance, but instead the Levant Herald operated in a gray zone between journalism and diplomacy, between local Ottoman politics and global imperial communication. All right, I think I should definitely stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Burhan. And next we have Michael Lewis.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this meeting. Yeah, my chapter was on the German Anglophone press in the long 19th century. And when I started, I quickly realized that there wasn't almost no literature so far. So what I would be doing would be probably more of a stock taking, first foray to see what is there. And this, of course, is a long period. I was looking at these periodicals were often very short-lived, very localized. And the region I was looking at was not yet a centralized state, but a patchwork of smaller, larger, various states. So yeah, this is visible still today because some of them I found in libraries, some in some small towns in Bavaria. So the research process was quite interesting. What I find interesting also is the sheer number of periodicals that I found, that I identified, but also their diversity, because finally in my article, I tried to divide them into 3 groups. The earliest ones were periodicals made by Anglophile Germans, often more aristocratic or bourgeois people who have spent time in Britain, and who made these, then started to make periodicals for like-minded Anglophiles. Then towards the end of the century, we have a large diversity with, for example, we have a professional and trade journals, quite in multiple languages often. And then towards the very end of the century come quite a number of periodicals from and for made by and for the Anglophone communities that resided in spa towns such as Baden-Baden or Wiesbaden, or in cultural centers such as Dresden. And these existed, what I also found astonishing, almost all of them existed until 1914 when the war broke out. So it was really an interruption. Yeah, and while it was a first inventory where I tried to include as many as I could find, I still found one after the book was already printed, so there are still more to be found. I hope that this article might serve as a starting point for other researchers or even myself if I find the time to look more closely into these periodicals. Especially since many of these publications shed light into, as was already said, into areas, fields, phenomena that were ignored or almost forgotten. For example, just already mentioned this strong Anglophilia among certain German upper classes in the outgoing 18th and early 19th century. And then later the life in these resort towns in Germany, which had a quite important number of Anglophone people living there. As, for example, in Dresden, there was a daily English newspaper that existed for almost a decade. So, yeah, this is something that I didn't know before, and it was really hard to find any information on this. So I hope that these periodicals might help to provide a more dynamic history of these communities, while maybe also allowing to retrace the transnational networks of people, of news, as we heard before, and of ideas that existed in this 19th century, despite even the growing rivalry between Germany and Great Britain later on in the century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. We have Will Hanley next, but I'm aware there are some technical issues. So are you okay, Will, to be presenting? Do you think you have the...
I hope so.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. I'm on a train, so if the connection breaks, feel free to just talk over me or let me know. Well, thank you for including me in this collection. I just want to say a couple words about my essay, which is about the Egyptian Gazette, an English language paper published in Alexandria and later in Cairo, beginning in 1880. And it's a paper which is still being published today, although in a much reduced and strange form. But it was an English language daily for decades and decades and decades. And a significant paper. Now, I am a historian of Egypt, and when I went to grad school, we were taught that English language newspapers were not the sort of source that we should be using to write social history, that we should be using archival documents, handwritten documents in Arabic. And so I shied away from sources like the Egyptian Gazette. But I began to use this source for teaching purposes, and my interest in the paper grew out of a desire to give my undergraduate students sources, primary sources in English that they could use to do some creative work on Egyptian history. So I designed a course which I've taught 7 or 8 times, in which students digitize issues of the newspaper. And out of this course, I've been able to produce about 1,000 digitized issues of varying quality. These issues, which we transform from microfilm into text, are in TEI XML. So it's an enriched text, which is available on a course website. So I've been working with this paper as a way of teaching computational methods to students and of getting them to work with English language primary sources. And as a result of this, my work with this paper has been very close to the text, and I've rarely had a chance to see the forest because I've been paying so much attention to the trees. So writing this paper for this collection allowed me to look at the forest, to look at the broader a broader perspective on the paper, and I was happy to do that. So in the paper, in the essay, I talk about two men who were editors of this paper and the sort of business that they were running. I tried to talk about their customers, what sort of news and information met the needs of their readership, which was limited to about 500 readers. They published about 500 copies every day of this paper at most. And their readership was largely interested in business questions. Because of my digitization project, I've had to work a lot with the financial tables in this paper, which made up about a quarter of the content of the paper, looking quite closely at the business news that it conveyed, and taking that content of the paper seriously, indeed privileging it over the political content, which normally is what I would read in this paper, has really changed my perspective on how the paper was produced. And in the essay, I argue that this paper was a service provider for the British occupation in Egypt, an occupation which was roughly coterminous with the newspaper, lasted from the 1880s to the 1950s. And what we see in the paper is infrastructure of this military occupation, talking about how to make money, talking about how to provision the military, talking about questions of rank and status, who occupies which positions in the bureaucracy. All of this was woven into the content of the newspaper, and indeed seems to be the mainstay of the newspaper. And I've come to see this kind of content as perhaps more important than any of the political news or even the society and musical news that it contained. Okay, so that's just sort of a brief summary of of what I brought to this project, and I want to say once again, thanks for including me. It really helped me to contextualize this source, which I had really fetishized in my teaching. It allowed me to think a bit more broadly about its meaning, and learned a lot from the other papers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Will. And we have Aled Jones next.
Hi, everyone. My chapter on the English language press in China fits into a larger project on how international trade, finance, colonial violence, and global information flows were facilitated by a transnational press and encoded, in this case, though clearly not in others, in the English language. What we find there is a networked information exchange system. I think Isabelle put it rather more succinctly when she referred to it as circularity, which then feeds intelligence to a number of different customers, including the Foreign Office of the British government, financial houses, trading companies, and also then is echoed through the national and the local press in the UK and beyond, indeed. So they almost act as news agencies, and all the way from the 1840s through to the interwar period. That's effectively the period I look at in this chapter. But I just wanted to make two very quick points. Two reflections really on the writing of it. What I enjoyed most about preparing this article for the volume was working in the Zikawei Library in Shanghai, which was established by Jesuit missionaries back in 1847. And while there are obviously enormous advantages in studying print in searchable digital formats, there's still so much to be gained by engaging with the physical paper itself. I think one reads paper differently, certainly more holistically. And the other dimension of that was working within the city where these were had been produced, or some of these titles had been produced. And also, it kind of sharpens one's sensitivity to the historical context of the archive itself. And that was viscerally true of the ZKW library, because the very paper I was reading owed its existence to the heroic efforts of the librarians to preserve those copies in the chaotic opening weeks of the Cultural Revolution 60 years ago. The other point I wanted to make is that I'm very aware that this chapter merely scratches the surface of what is a much bigger and more complex set of global interrelationships. And that the chapter really does need to be read alongside others in the volume, particularly perhaps Dr. Constantini's excellent chapter that follows it. I sent the chapter as a draft to a number of scholars in China for their comment, because I was very aware that it was all coming from a Western perspective, or largely a Western perspective. And among the replies I received was one who said that she'd been prompted by the article to start a new research project in China on Shenbao, which is one of the titles I mentioned in it. And it is so vitally important to get a Chinese perspective on this complex, interconnected history. And when that happens, I think the editors will have really left us all with a very fertile legacy indeed. And I'd like to thank them very much for that. And as we are talking about China, may I wish you all a happy New Year of the Horse, Xinyan Kuaila, and that, I think, is my 4 minutes done.
Thank you so much, Aled. And we have Jennifer Hayward next.
So I'm going to stop this.
Great. Thank you, Isabelle. And I'll start sharing.
Yeah, I don't remember how I should do that. Oop.
Is this okay?
I don't know. I don't seem to be able to.
It's okay.
I can see, yeah.
We can see part 5, Latin America.
Perfect. That's wonderful. Echoing the thanks to the organizers for putting together this session. And I'd also really like to thank Isabelle and Diana for spearheading this really groundbreaking volume. Michelle and I have loved being part of it and editing the Latin American section. In my few minutes today, I really just want to highlight the amazing chapters contributed by our authors, and especially the newspaper titles they focus on, especially because most are here today. So Alina, Sandra, and Michelle will all be happy to answer questions later, I'm sure. But first, a super quick overview of the Latin American section. So part 5 of the Global History surveys the contributions from Latin America to the 19th century English language press. And like the volume overall, our approach is interdisciplinary. Our introduction and the chapters to follow explore the press in tandem with the rise of Latin America's national presses, as well as with the sociocultural and the economic and especially the technological conditions that enable it. Michelle will be talking a bit about the rise of the steamship circulations of newspapers, for example. So network circulations and exchange are a big theme throughout the chapters. We also find that Latin America is especially interesting as a site of newspaper production and consumption, because it's a site of informal rather than formal empire, right? So there's not much that's been done in terms of work on the English language press in the region, because it's been really left out of studies of empire. Nevertheless, the connections between the hemispheres were really essential in terms of Britain's own construction of its imperial identity. It's also really interesting, like most port cities worldwide, right, that especially the ports became multilingual contact zones. So either Spanish or Portuguese. Print was strong in the region, but there were also presses from many other European languages. And of course, there are other spoken languages. We do want to highlight that in most countries in South America, indigenous language publishing was largely suppressed in the 19th century. And one thing Michelle and I have worked on is trying to bring some of those voices into the fore a little bit more. In terms of the frames, I'm going to skip over this quite quickly, actually, because Isabelle already summarized our broad approach. We too are focusing on the circularity and flows of information across global transnational press networks. So I will move on to the individual chapters. Michelle will be presenting next on the English language press in America's West Coast, focusing on circulations. And as you can see, she covers a wide range of titles. Alina, who is here today, looks at the Argentinian press and mentions quite a few titles, but these are the three that she mostly focuses on. Jesse Reeder, who wasn't able to make it today, focuses on a specific incident in Uruguay and its coverage in the Britannia and Montevideo Reporter. And what's fascinating there is the way that Jesse looks at the national versus the British commercial interests and the ways that the press kind of traces transformations and reciprocal influence in those. Sandra, who is here, focuses on English language newspapers in Rio de Janeiro and the British influence in that region. And finally, I talk about the 14 port city newspapers in Valparaiso and their broader circulations, as well as their relationships with the national press as well. And then in closing, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the challenges of working on the foreign language press in Latin America. Diana noted this in starting off, that studies of the foreign language press worldwide share a common challenge, finding those papers, and especially because they really fall between the cracks of national collections. So they're doubly marginalized. And so in looking at studies of the 19th century newspaper press, we're attentive to the fact that absence of specific voices, specific perspectives are often archival rather than historical. And so Michelle and I have been working to digitize, as clearly many of us have, and yet we want to remain conscious of the fact that digitization too can flatten context. So we're working to pair the digitization with preservation efforts within Chile and also decolonizing our research priorities globally, which is what this volume does, really. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we have Michelle as the last speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll share my screen now. Okay. Okay. Well, following the independence of South American republics in the early 19th century, the West Coast transformed into a central space for global trade and migration. We argue in our chapter that the English language press functioned as a fundamental space where local and global news intersected through a network of printing offices, editors, and commercial agents. I'm moving to the next slide. Well, driven by British informal imperialism and the rise of free trade, these newspapers served as vital cultural anchors for migrant communities in port cities like Valparaiso in Chile and Panama, not only for the British community, other foreign communities as well. Our research seeks to highlight how technological innovations, specifically steam navigation and transoceanic telegraph cables, accelerate the movement of information, goods, and people across hemispheric borders. Specialized steamer editions and English foreign language newspapers facilitated a unique intercultural exchange, allowing ideas to circulate and blend with local Latin American contexts. These Victorian publications illustrate how human networks and industrial technology transformed the region into a highly interconnected global space between Panama and the Strait of Magellan. Thus, this work provides a look into how the English language press serves as a vital contact zone, as previously mentioned, along South America's west coast during the 19th century. By examining the circulation, networks, and exchanges of these periodicals, we discover how they were much more than just printed sources of news. They were central to the social and cultural fabric of British communities settled in the region. Our chapter explores several facts that shaped this era and context. First, we aim to illustrate how the Pacific Steam Navigation Company and the later introduction of the telegraph cable were instrumental in the rapid dissemination of information. The development of steamers editions, these newspapers produced specifically to be carried on and distributed by steamships since the 1840s, demonstrate how technology and the press mutually reinforced each other to bridge vast transoceanic distances. This era also saw the rise of global news agencies like Reuters and Havas, which established offices in cities like Valparaiso in Chile and Lima in Peru, further integrating the West Coast into the global information circuit. Second, cultural and linguistic hybridity. These newspapers, such as the Valparaiso Echo and the Panama Mail, operated in both English and in Spanish, catering to both expatriates and local populations. This hybridity allowed for significant cultural transfers, as mentioned by Isabelle at the beginning, such as the dissemination to a Latin American readership of Victorian literature, British sports, political ideas, and public debates, such as the woman question. Third, our chapter situates these publications within the context of British informal imperialism, where merchants, editors, and commercial agents acted as transcultural agents themselves. These human networks, combined with the kinetic geography of the coast, facilitated a reciprocal exchange. This circularity that Isabelle was mentioning too, where news from South America also found its way back to British readers through specialized papers such as the South American Journal published in London. And fourth, the tension of fixity and flow. We conclude our chapter by framing the production and reception of this press as a result of the tension between the fixity or stability of settled communities and the flow of or disruptive kinetic energy, we could say, of global trade and ideas of global displacement. Finally, this contribution to the volume seeks to underscore the importance of the west coast of South America, often viewed as peripheral. It's a deeply interconnected space of transoceanic global exchanges, as we have seen. Well, that's it. Thank you so much.
Lovely, thank you all so much. And we've had such lovely. I have so many questions because it's quite connected to what I do. But I will now open the room up for questions. I'm aware we have a very short amount of time, so if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hands, and you can either put that in the chat box and I can read it out for you, or you can ask it by unmuting yourself or showing up on video if you like. Okay. So I think I might start with a question, which is basically for everyone who's spoken today in general, but also maybe I'll start with Diana and Isabel. And this was to do with readership, and this is coming from a place of someone who doesn't know much about the non-Anglophone, or the Anglophone press in non-Anglophone countries much. But I was just wondering if the readership, if there's any evidence that the readership came from outside the British expatriate community, if there was, if there's any evidence of people who were not from these communities also showing an interest in these periodicals and reading them.
Maybe I can quickly
Yeah, sure.
I think I was sorry. My mic was off, so I was talking to myself. Sorry. So shall I go on? Or yeah. So I was talking about Italy. First of all, to give you some figures, some of the most famous, like the Florence and Italian Gazette, they sold 5,000 copies per week, and 1 week, 2 or 3 times a month, they could be sold out. So there was a large readership. There was a large community of expatriates. At the time, there were about, they represented 12% of the population in Florence, the British expatriates. But we also have signed that they were read by Italian Anglophile, who were numerous because of the support Great Britain gave to the Risorgimento. And we can see in the Vieuxeux circulating library, which was patronized by many British intellectuals, that it was read. And also that many people from England subscribed to it. So it was also circulated. And there was another newspaper in Rome, I think it's called the, forgotten its title, the Roman Mail, something, which sold about 12,000 copies per week. So it's quite a large number. So you had to take into account large local expatriate communities, a large growing number of travelers, but also a very important community of Italian intellectuals, writers, because they were mostly cultural newspapers that read and sometimes wrote also in these newspapers.
Thank you. It's always fascinating. It's always fascinating to hear about the reach of the readership. Michael, I believe you had something to share as well.
Yeah, I can. For the case of Germany, I can say that there were both. So towards the end of the century, you really had also these large communities of expatriates who made these journals for themselves. Like there was one, the Wiesbaden, which is on the cover, where they even listed the new arrivals with the hotels so that people knew, oh, I know that guy, and could go there and meet them. In the earlier century, these were really, there were no, the numbers of Anglophones living in Germany were really too small to sustain any larger publication, except for Hamburg, which was a commercial port. So these were really intellectuals who were German-speaking, but learned English, were Anglophiles. Some of these, there was an illustrated journal towards the mid of the century, which was directed at the young, fashionable lady who would learn English. And you can see this in the contents. These were really stories and images which were deemed suitable for this readership. So they were both. And there was a switch towards the middle of the century. So, yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Diana, do you want to say something?
Yes, I'd just like to say something concerning Galignani's Messenger, which was a daily paper in English published from 1814 to 1890 in Paris. It was read worldwide. You could find it in many reading rooms in Europe, and it's quoted in in other newspapers. Some French intellectuals also read it because they wanted to know what was going on in the British political system. And you can see also how widely it was read because it's quoted in many novels, notably, for instance, in one of Turgenev's novels, where you have someone standing in a reading room holding Galignani's Messenger.
Lovely.
Can I?
There's a comment from Alison saying, "I wish Galignani's
Yeah.
Messenger was digitized."
It is digital. It is digitized, isn't it? It is. You go on the Gallica site on the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it is digitized. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. We have a question from. Sorry.
It's the only English language paper printed in France which is digitized.
Yeah.
Can I?
No, there
can
are
I,
a few others. Sorry. So,
Can I just
Alan,
comment on the question about readership? I was thinking while the others were speaking. I think you can rephrase the question in a sense, or rethink it in some of the papers I've been studying. Because if you take a title like The Homeward Mail, I mean, what a beautifully evocative title that was, isn't it? It's produced in the Far East and brought homeward back to the metropole, to London or whatever. I don't know about the readers as such, but what you can do, I think, is map the geography of empire from the mid-century into the early 20th century by the ports they stop at, they report from, and they clearly drop off copies, and then gather news all the way from China through India, Malaya, as it was then, Aden, and then through the Suez Canal after the late 60s. So you can map this extraordinary journey that maintained this information flow across the empire. And so the readers were all along those shipping routes, effectively.
Shows you how these periodicals become vehicles of just knowledge and mobility. Very interesting. Thank you. We have a question from Matt Poland who says, "Question raised for me by Michelle, but I'd love to hear what others have to say. You mentioned the circulation of British literature in South American periodicals, and I'd love to hear more about the presence and circulation of literature and or quote unquote literary news in these archives." It's open to everyone, but maybe Michelle, you could start.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this is a fascinating issue. You can read, on one side, you can find advertisings coming from the local libraries, especially during Christmas times, promoting the books that have just arrived in Chile, in Valparaiso. That's the case, I know better. So, of course, on the second half of the 19th century, you would find Dickens or George Eliot, etc. And also you can find criticism on some of the reviews on those books, on this new literature. On the other hand, you can sometimes find the publication of stories in the serialized stories, right? So you have to follow to the next number to continue reading the story. That's the case of Dickens, for example. And yeah, and Jennifer, of course, can tell you more about the British writers whose work circulated in Chile at the time. And on the other hand, it's very interesting to see the reception of those books in the Chilean case. Some of the national critics with a more conservative view would be very would criticize, for example, political thought or philosophical thought coming from John Stuart Mill, for example, regarding the woman question in the local Chilean press, interacting with the Anglophone British press of Valparaiso. In that case, it's the Chilean Times. But Jennifer can give you more names, I'm sure.
I'll just jump in quickly to say that for me, what's most fascinating is tracing British literature through scissors and paste journalism. So pirated copies of books that were serialized, for example, in the Chilean Times. But even more than that, the literature written by the colonists and then published in the newspapers. So there's Edward Swinglehurst, who wrote poems and published them regularly, and several others. But most of the home or the locally authored content comes in the women's sections that Michael was referring to as happening in the German Anglophone papers as well, and in the children's section. And for me, that's the most fascinating because the stories that were written by Anglo-Chileans and published in the Children's Corner, it was called, in the paper The Star of Chile, often bring in indigenous themes. So it's not the same as getting indigenous perspectives or voices, but it's very clear that these children are growing up side by side in the south of Chile with indigenous families, and that they are learning the language, learning the culture, and so on. So that's a really interesting trace as far as thinking about who the local readership is and what their interests and experiences were.
Thank you, Michelle and Jennifer. I believe Preeti had a question. No? Okay, lovely. And Jasleen, I think Jasleen put her hand up. Do you have a question that you want to ask? Or you can pop in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. Are you able to hear me? Okay. Hi. Yeah, okay. Hi. So I just had this question. Like, I heard a couple of speakers talk about how some of these periodicals were getting published for ages and ages, and some of them are still getting published. I'm just wondering if any speaker, like if any author has worked on a periodical that wasn't published for long, but of course, like is a rich archive about like, that the region. And so and what are the challenges if that's the case? So what are the challenges in working with a periodical for which we do not have like a longer kind of a publication history when we kind of if they decided to work on something like that? So thank you.
Who? Maybe Diana and Isabelle, do you want to start?
I'm answering a question. It was a written question, so I'm answering it. Just about this thing about literature, we can also see in some countries how these newspapers were an outlet for would-be writers. It was very much the case in Italy, where you had a lot of intellectual artists or would-be writers who resided in Florence, for instance, because it was much cheaper. And they started publishing short stories or to fill in the pages sometimes of the Florence Gazette. At its beginning, the editor would ask residing writers to publish some of their material in the Gazette. So there were, I think, in one or two chapters, you have how the examples of how these newspaper and magazine could be sort of a first step towards a writing career later on in England, for instance. I'm trying to.
I think we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. But it was so lovely to hear everyone who's contributed to this collection to speak on so many different things, and nice to learn about new geographical areas. So thank you. And if anyone wants to,
Well, thank you very much to you.
Oh, thank you.
Hosting this.
And Alison has also popped information about the next digital event in the chat, and it will also be on the RSVP website. So hopefully see most of you at that one. Bye, everyone.